All right. Hello, designers and design nerds. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you are in the country and around the world. It's always great to see you. We're going to give it a few seconds for people to join us here in the Zoom and to connect with us on our live stream on the AIGA Design LinkedIn, YouTube, and Facebook pages. But as always, say hi, tell us who you are, where you're tuning in from. We'd love to hear from you. And any other summer reading you're doing if you need another prompt. But we're here to talk about this book, which I have in my hand, and you can order soon. It's currently in pre-order. It's shipping out later this month or later in July, Designing Peace, Building a Better Future Now, published by ARTBOOK. We'll post a link in the chat as well, so you can order that, but also a reminder that we have a discount code. You can use AIGA member 25 to get a discount on Designing Peace, Building a Better Future Now on artbook.com. So look out for that link and that coupon code in the chat, and also on AIGA.org if you would like that. All right, so we'll go ahead and kick things off and introduce our guest author for the day. But I also want to remind you, a friendly reminder of our code of conduct here at AIGA. We've just updated the language of that, but basically keep it kind, keep it professional, and we'll be problem-free. All right, with that said, I'm going to go ahead and introduce our partner. And sorry for the quick correction as well. It's published by the Cooper Hewitt. ARTBOOK is the distributor, so you can get the book from artbook.com, but the publisher is the Cooper Hewitt, and we'll talk more about that institution in a little bit. Today, we have as our special guest, Cynthia E. Smith, who edited and wrote parts of the book. Cynthia is trained as an industrial designer, and for over a decade, she led multidisciplinary planning and design projects for cultural institutions. After earning a graduate degree at Harvard University's Kennedy School of Government, Cynthia joined the Cooper Hewitt, where she integrates her work experience with her advocacy on human rights and social justice issues as their curator of socially responsible design. So Cynthia, it's so good to have you here today. Oh, you're on mute.
There we go. So happy to be here today to talk to you, Sean.
Awesome. Well, first off, maybe before we talk about the book, could you tell us a little bit more about the Cooper Hewitt and your role there?
Sure. Cooper Hewitt is one of two Smithsonian museums that are located in New York City. Most of them, the rest of them are on the Mall in Washington, D.C. We're located at 91st and 5th Avenue along Museum Mile. We're in the Andrew Carnegie Mansion. We have an amazing collection that spans 30 centuries. That the object that's in our collection from that long ago is a textile, but we have a whole range of objects in our collection. Yeah, I'm the curator of socially responsible design and put together a whole set of humanitarian design exhibitions, books, programs.
Wonderful. All right. Well, so we're talking about this book, Designing Peace, and we could spend probably hours and hours defining design and defining peace. And there are concrete examples and case studies here in the book. But could you give us maybe build on this working definition of what is peace and how do we design for it beyond maybe the dictionary definition of just the absence of war and violent conflict? What do you mean by peace in the context of this collection?
So the basis and the aim of the book and the exhibition, which is on display right now at Cooper Hewitt, is to challenge the typical discourse on conflict and peace and to create an international dialogue. So what we're doing right now is part of that, hopefully part of that dialogue. But we also put it together to demonstrate that peace is not simply the absence of war. It's rather a dynamic and complex process that can be built and nurtured in a multitude of ways in different contexts and at different scales. So in the book, I write about the different definitions of peace, and it's not exhaustive. It's just a selection of ways that different peace researchers and designers have been thinking about it. That's included in my introductory essay, Designing the Future Now. And so John Gut, I always mispronounce his name, Galtung, he's the founder of Peace Studies, in 1964 came up with this definition of negative peace, which is defined by what is not there, as you said, the absence of violence and war. And then there's positive peace, a definition which is what is there, the presence of social justice, of equality, of harmonious social relations. And this is where I think design can play a significant role. And just to give it a little bit of context, Martin Luther King talked about this kind of peace as far back as 1956 when he was giving a sermon in Montgomery, Alabama, and he said, "True peace is not merely the absence of tension, but it's the presence of justice." And so positive peace is what I focused on in the book. I also, there were a couple other descriptions of peace that when I was doing my research, I was speaking to a senior researcher in Oslo at the Peace Research Institute, Oslo. And whenever I met with people, I would ask them, what's your definition of peace? And I thought his was extremely powerful. And we have some examples of people who think this way in the exhibition. He said, peace is defined by the people living in these places. It's a lived experience, that peace is the absence of fear. And then another one is this idea that peace is not a passive concept. And one peace researcher in Mexico, Pietro Patella, engages in a disobedient peace, which calls attention to injustice through acts of defiance, disobedience, and non-cooperation with inhumane social orders. So there's a whole range of peace, but often they're very active and dynamic.
Yeah, I love those active, dynamic definitions and the absence of fear. And I like how it's also both defined by the positive and also the negative. And so there's so much to that. And I look forward to looking at some of the examples, the design examples, a little bit later from the book and from the exhibition. But let's follow up a little bit. I'd love to learn a little bit more about the background story, the backstory of how this happened. What drove you to write this book, put together this book and this exhibition?
So as often the germ of it, the beginnings of it happened years before it actually floats to the top. So over the years, I've done a lot of field research. For a set of years, I was working on an exhibition and book by the people designing a better America. And I was traveling all over the United States. I think I logged 50,000 miles between air and driving. I didn't drive all of that. But I was meeting with people who were living, the exhibition was about the intersection of innovation, poverty, and design. So I was going to places where there was multiple generational poverty throughout the U.S. And what I was witnessing were these communities that were coming together, that they were coming up with solutions, and they were working. This was a very divisive time. It was leading up to the 2016 elections, as you can recall. I mean, it might not have been as divisive as today, but it was a pretty divisive time. And I saw people just putting aside their differences and coming together and using design to create these really wonderful solutions within the community. And so after I opened that show, thought about it for a while, I began to think, what if we thought about this level of cooperation at a different scale. What might be possible if society were to design for peace? And so that laid the foundation. That was the basis for my research for the next 5 years. And what I did over that period is I was meeting with designers, architects, artists, activists, peace researchers, everyday citizens, whoever would talk to me about it, who were actively engaged in building peace.
And so you have various audiences for this book and this exhibition. There are design practitioners, a lot of the folks watching this live stream or watching this recording right now, but as a Smithsonian institution, it's also the general public, right? Everyone who's visiting the museum or looking at some of these things online. Who do you have in mind as the target reader of this book or the target readers of this book as you've put it together?
Yeah, we always put together, we work together with our a wonderful team at Cooper Hewitt, and we start to think about that really early on, because it really does help us frame and formulate how it's laid out, what might be included, how we're going to write it, all kinds of, it has so much impact on how we approach this. So we definitely thought that it would be designers and architects, domestic and international, educators, academics, university students, also peace advocates, educators, researchers, and then a broader group, readers who are interested in international relations, international development, humanitarian aid, sustainable peace processes, public policy, history, sustainability, digital culture, social impact, social justice, just a whole range of people. So that all of that thinking goes into how we approach the making of the book.
Great. Well, let's talk a bit about some of the questions that you're exploring in the book and the structure of the book. We have access to a few digital versions of the pages from the book to help us with this conversation. So I'm going to do the screen share on my end and pull up first the table of contents so we can talk about the structure. Can you tell us a little bit about how you've structured this book and the different questions that you're exploring?
Absolutely. So along with thinking about the audience, we also think about kind of what is the vision for this book? How can we say it in one sentence? And so the book was organized, laid out, and designed as a handbook for envisioning the world we want to live in. One of the things we create, we put together some front matter, and about, almost towards the end of putting the entire manuscript together, we start to collect all of the letters from the writing for the preface, for the foreword. And we thought about, what if we engaged with this wonderful author and peace builder, international peace builder, John Paul Lederach. And he's, and some of you might know of his work, he's the author of this renowned book, The Moral Imagination, The Art and Soul of Building Peace, which actually has spurred a lot of conversation in the creative fields and then in the design field. So he wrote us this really evocative set of verses called Musing on Peace. And for me, it was almost, and it's not, this is not a religious book, but it felt like a prayer, to a secular prayer, perhaps. But it was really a beautiful way. We thought we could open the book. And then, of course, we have the voice of the museum, the foreword by our acting director at the time, Ruki Nuhold Ravikumar. And then we have this wonderful preface by Darren Walker, who's the president of the Ford Foundation, who has long been a supporter of my work over the years. So that was wonderful to have in the book. And then I wrote an introductory essay, Designing the Future Now. And then the center interiors, maybe we can, well, maybe let's just stop for a second. I want to show those, but the center of the book, the interior, is arranged around 5 provocative questions, and then we can go to those slides. And then the last section is the back matter, which is the selected biography, kind of typical acknowledgements, index, image credits, and then we have a design note by the authors or the designers of the book. But maybe you want to go ahead and show the 5 questions, which are the next. We can just show those really quickly. These were the 5 provocative questions that we organized the exhibition around. How can design engage creative confrontation? Oh, no, this one's how can design support humane forms of peace and security? The next one. How can design address the root causes of conflict? The next one. Engage creative confrontation. Next. How can design embrace truth and dignity in a search for peace and justice? I think there's a 5th one. Let's see if there's another one. Yeah. How can design facilitate the transition from instability to peace? So it's this whole idea of before conflict occurs, during conflict, and post-conflict, and we have examples of all of those. So maybe we want to flip back to the table of contents. I don't know. That might be good. So within each one of these sections, and you can see they're color-coded. The colors don't necessarily have any meaning, but they're just to create distinction between the 5 different sections. And included in each one of those, we have both written visual essays and interviews with public artists, creative activists, urbanists, peace researchers, political scientists, design practitioners, and then interspersed within all of those, because the content speaks to each other, are these profiles of the design works that are actually included in the exhibition, and those are fully illustrated.
Awesome. So we'll go into a few examples, some case studies. We've chosen 3 today to highlight. Before we do that, I just wanted to pause and welcome people who have maybe joined us since we first kicked off this live stream, and just say hello. Thank you for introducing yourselves. It looks like we have folks from both coasts and through the middle of the country, and some international folks as well. So just wanted to welcome you again in case you missed the very beginning. And also, I thought it might be cool to share some lines from the Musings on Peace by John Paul Lederach. I have a copy of the book here, and I thought I'd just read a few lines to give some folks some context. So Cynthia had mentioned that it's not a religious book, but it does feel like this poem, which has 7 different verses here, really sets the stakes or the solemnity of what this means and how big this topic can be. So I'll just read, I guess, the first verse. We sat in roofless church in the East Coast region of Nicaragua. The burnt vigas offering open skies above us were not by original design. They fell in fragile placement when mortars destroyed mortar. A standing bell tower and a foot-pushed pump organ brought us to attention. Pieces around a war puzzle assembled. People watched, mum and curious. In this place of deep division and irreplaceable loss, some noise and rumors of peace had brought them in from the surrounding bush. The call to order started with words of an aged poet. Truth and mercy have met together. Justice and peace have kissed. Wow, there's so much there, and it's like not what you would expect in a design book about peace necessarily, but I feel like there's something just really human about it and so specific about this setting in Nicaragua that John Paul Lederach is writing about, but really kind of sets the scene for a lot of different things.
Yeah, he's pretty amazing. If he writes about it, I write a little bit about it in my essay, and I hope that people would take inspiration from his work because it does kind of float throughout a lot of this work. He writes from moral imagination. We must find ways to foster moral imagination, the capacity to recognize turning points and possibilities, to venture down unknown paths and create what does not yet exist. And I think this idea of building the future now, which is kind of the subtitle of the publication, it's this idea of prefigurative intervention, is really critical when for designers, because, and I'm trained as a designer, this capacity to envision and design alternatives to injustice in advance of achieving them. So really creating something that hasn't yet happened, but showing the rest of the world what might be possible. And so he goes on in moral imagination. And I think this is so profound. Trust that creative and meaningful change is possible, and seek constructive engagement with the people and things we fear most and least understand. I cannot think of a more appropriate thing to be thinking about with the kind of conversations that are going on today, the public discourse. We really have to, from my perspective and what we try to explore within the exhibition and in the book, are these ideas of thinking beyond the other.
Wonderful. So let's get specific. I'm going to fast forward through this PDF to the first of the three projects that we wanted to talk through. And I also see this audience question about how do you go about collecting these pieces and projects? I'm sure you'll just weave that in your answer, but this is the first example, the first case study project in the book from Michael Murphy, an architect of peace. Can you tell us a bit about this?
Sure. So I don't lose that thread. I'll that question. So the research is so incredibly exciting to do. You start to talk to people. I put together an advisory committee. I put together an international advisory committee. And for this particular one, it was peace researchers and designers. And those were kind of broad categories because they were scientists and, advocates and architects and you name it, but they were kind of those two camps. And then we explore the thesis, this idea, this big question: how might design, how might we design for peace? But I start to throw a really wide web. I start to talk to as many people as I can. I talked about that a little bit earlier, as many people as I can. And then every time I speak to somebody, I ask them, who do you suggest I speak with? Where do you think I'm missing? And so it just begins to build. And then the part of being a curator, is then you start to sort and select over and over and over again. It's all the things we learned to do when we were small children. In kindergarten, you sort and select. And that's the joy of it. You get to meet some of the most incredible people. And I have to say, for this particular project, it was during I had done a bunch of research prior to the pandemic, and then the pandemic hit. And so we had these most interesting conversations with people around the world, and it really puts you in this new, we connected in a way that I had never connected with people before, because I had to do this research. Say I was talking to an architect in India, I had to research to find out what was happening in Mumbai, because you had to be sensitive to what everybody was going through. If you can take yourself back to those first days, those first months, it was rolling across the world. And so there was this real compassion and sense of care that was going on that I think is embodied in this kind of work, which leads me to Michael Murphy, who is a great example of that kind of work. So what I'm going to show you are 3 examples of the way we organize the book, but they're also kind of the thinking of that's exhibited within the book, the writing. So we had essays. We had some long essays. We had shorter essays. We invited people to write these. And we had visual essays. So I'm going to show you one of the longer essays, Michael Murphy. I'm going to show you a visual essay, and then one of these profiles of the project, one of the designs, the design works that's in the book. So this one, Architecture of Peace, written by Michael Murphy, who some of you may know. He's the founder of Mass Design Group. He wrote about monuments and memorials as key sites of empathy and identification. And he noted that the most powerful memorials, those that honor and connect with individual stories while also evoking the multitude of lives lost, will be those that contribute the most to peace. So making that empathetic connection with individuals, but being able to help people understand kind of the magnitude of something that happened. And he's designed a beautiful memorial down in Montgomery, Alabama. That's part of the Legacy Museum. Also, I think a memorial on gun violence, and this is shown within the essay. We have images of those. So one of the ways that working with the wonderful book designers, New Zealand book designers practice, we decided that we would need to put, because it's this handbook, we wanted it to be really accessible to people, that they could easily understand what they were looking at and find the information. So we color coded it. They came up with this wonderful color coding system. And we put a large title at the top, along with the author's name, and then we placed the bio down below. So you've got kind of this headline information at the top, and then we also color coded the kind of wayfinding information along the bottom of the page. You know, the section you're in, the essay you're reading, the author, the page. Color coded that matched the section you were in. The other choice that practice made was to place the photo captions. Sometimes those are placed in other books I've worked at. We place them at the bottom of the page. They wanted that information directly with the images. So that was a clear choice. And that's universal throughout the layout of the book. And then if you want to go to the next page, we can flip through this beautiful images throughout the next page, please. Yeah, we would sometimes have full page spreads. This one's from the Southern Poverty Law group. Next page. And yeah, and then here, whenever we had special text like endnotes, they chose to use different font from what was used in the rest of the body of the text. So there were some clear choices to really help the reader navigate through kind of some often pretty dense writing. Not dense, I would say, moving writing, you know, some of this is really quite moving.
Right. I
So
feel like it balances a lot of these sort of elements where there's like kind of real life conflict or post-conflict that's happened to real people, but you also have, I mean, I see Foucault, Deleuze, and Guattari in the footnotes, but then you also have these really concrete projects of like, here's an architectural installation or here's a social project.
yeah, and this is one of his designs here. It's the gun violence project, I believe, memorial. And that's quite an amazing.
I think that's as far as it zooms in, but
yeah. And then here they had installed it at the National Building Museum, but he had collaborated with mothers who had lost children to gun violence. Some of the background on some of this work is quite compelling. But this is just one essay of a number that are included in the book. So maybe we can move on to the next one, which is an example of a visual essay. And this is by Mir Bidir. She's, I believe, generally located in Hong Kong, but she's a world traveler. And this particular visual essay. So we invited a number of designers to create what we were calling visual essays, primarily information that was going to be provided to the reader through an illustration or images or graphic material. And if you flip to the next page, you'll see the full illustration of this. It's an actual place in Turkey. And Merv, I met her when I was on an international research fellowship in the Netherlands. She was traveling through. And I was introduced to her, and she's trained as an architect, but she's also the member of, and I think this is very telling of the kind of architects and designers who are involved in this kind of work. She's also the member of a women's collective, Kitchen and Garden, in Turkey. And this was established by local women in solidarity with newly arriving Syrian migrant women, refugees. And what she did, she'd written about this and showed this. A lot of people were very interested in this particular work, but when we talked to her about it, she said, "Why don't I illustrate and share the values of the kitchen?" And so that's what this illustration does. And these include, and those are kind of listed around the center of it, but they include collective belonging, justice, learning together, unconditional hospitality. And so for the book, for the layout for the book, can you turn back to the page before, please?
Sorry.
No worries.
There we go.
Yeah. So here we echo the similar large title, color-coded to the section it's in, put the author's name there at the top so you immediately know who authored this, who illustrated this, their bio below. But then we give you a preview of what's to come. We asked them, anyone who was included to write us a short paragraph, and here Merv was kind enough to do that, and also kind of list the material that gets explored in the illustration. And I think this was really, we wanted to create kind of a wonderful dialogue. And if we have an opportunity, if there's time, I can talk about kind of the making of the book and why we ended up thinking like this, because it did have to do with a whole set of serendipitous events. But we had a number of these visual installations, or visual spreads within the essays within the book. So why don't we flip to Christmas operations? Yes. Right. So yeah. So this is an example of one of the projects that designs we call them design works, within that's not only in the physical exhibition, we also have a digital exhibition that people can access from anywhere, but also within the book. So we wanted to, and these are interspersed in each one of the sections. And so Christmas Operations was an example of this. It's within this section that calls for a more humane approach to peace and security. And this that values local participation, less on military actions. And yet, this is a great example of how that could be made realized. So Christmas Operations is from Colombia, the country Colombia, and the Colombian Defense Ministry engaged a local Bogota-based creative agency to design a series of campaigns to persuade Colombian rebels, FARC guerrillas, to demobilize and find their way back home. And because this creative agency, and it was important that they were local, they understood the culture, and Colombia is a very Catholic country, so they understood that Christmas played an important, could play an important role. And they created 5 different campaigns, and we only show 2 within the exhibition and here in the book. And the one on the lower right is Mother's Voice. And these were posters that were that they designed, that they deployed in villages that were near the guerrilla camps. And they say, before you were a guerrilla fighter, you were my daughter. Before you were a guerrilla fighter, you were my son. At Christmas, everything is possible. And so it's this real beautiful message of humanity from a mother to her child. And they were successful with these campaigns, and they would learn from each campaign. They were iterative. And these images are actually childhood photos of the guerrillas. And they use these images because only the guerrillas themselves knew that this was a photograph of themselves, and this kept them safe. So they could then come home, they could demobilize. And the other example, if we pull out, was this one called Rivers of Light. You can see they manufactured these floating globes. They had LED lights in them, and they would write these notes to the guerrillas, asking them to demobilize, to come home, that they were still part of the society, that they wanted them back. And they put beautiful memorabilia within them. And because the rivers that came in, flowed into the jungles were like highways, they thought of using these. That's where their supplies came in and out. They said, why don't we use those and float these down the rivers? And they did this. And this one in particular was quite successful. I think the statistic was like 6 guerrillas a day demobilized. Some incredible number of guerrillas came home. But again, the design of the page was really important to us. So instead of the really large, we did have a large title for the spread. It was a little bit smaller than the essay, so it kind of had this differentiation between them. Also color coded, and then we placed, the really what we thought was the important information. Within a label in an exhibition, we call it the tombstone, which is kind of a
some inside exhibition design term there.
Yeah, it's kind of a funny term, right? But it's all the important information that you would find, the names, who designed it, the collaborators, the location of where it took place, the years it took place. Yeah, and then throughout the book, we had several opportunities to open here to this 2-page spread, and we took advantage of that. Sometimes it would be a full photograph like this, or it would be drawings, or a series of drawings, an illustration. And we were very strategic about which ones we would include. We made sure we had one in every one of the sections. And I think it was pretty successful. Yeah.
All right. Well, we have a question from Patrick in the Q&A, and I'll exit the screen share now, but it has to do with that Christmas operations project in particular. Patrick points out, or has this question of, how do we evaluate peace projects led by an active belligerent in a conflict, given that the Christmas operations projects were paid for, had the stamp of the Colombian Ministry of Defense on them, which had its own, was responsible for its own atrocities in part in the conflict. So what is a genuine overture to peace, and what is an attempt to demoralize an opponent on the battlefield?
That's a lot. That's multiple questions. That's pretty complex. I think I can talk about why this one was in particular selected for the book. We weren't necessarily looking for quote unquote solutions, but we were looking for creative responses. And so this was a good example of, while this was a military, this is the Defense Department, they were not using necessarily military actions, overt violent actions in this set of campaigns. So for me, it embodied this whole idea of, what if we flip the conversation? What if we started to invest in peace rather than militarization? I mean, if you look at the numbers of the amount of funding that we put towards military security, what if, and there's conversations, there's a UN paper that wrote about this, what if we just took 10% of that money and put it towards social programs, environmental programs, what would be possible? And so if you notice, it's a series of questions. How might, how can design? And so these aren't necessarily prescriptions, but open up to larger questions. So.
Right, and I think it was helpful to go back to that triangle that we saw briefly with the Johann Galtung, like triangle with like physical violence, but then other forms of violence, right? That it's not necessarily a binary of like, this is violent and this is peaceful, but it could be a less violent or less kind of physically violent thing. But you could still consider some of these kind of structural issues there at play for the people who are out there considering demobilizing from the guerrillas. We have a question from Dominic in LinkedIn about this, a different question that's more about the design of the book itself. For the full page spreads, how did the seam when printed affect the readability of the information in the book? Dominic, if you're still there, I have the actual spread here, and you can see I'm not an expert on the terminology for this, but the book is sewn together, and so something like this full bleed thing will like sit flat on my table, and the parts with text are still, have a margin and stuff like that, but the text isn't full bleed. It's just these full page images. I don't know if there's more you wanted to add to that, Cynthia.
No, I think you answered it. I think you probably know more about that than I do.
Wonderful. Well, I wanted to invite other folks, if you have questions, to chime in now. We have about 15 minutes left. And Rachel, I see your hand for this webinar thing. Unfortunately, I'm not able to add you to this, but if you type in your question in the Q&A, we can bring that up. So you mentioned earlier, Cynthia, that and Pamela from the publisher and distributor is chiming in, said we ensured we had lay flat binding. So it's bound in a way that it will lay flat for things like this. This is also something we saw digitally before with the Confederate iconography infographic, right? So you're able to just put it on your table and it will lie flat.
It's a wonderful, none of my previous books have done this. And I have to tell you, it's such a joy to read a book like this where it lays flat.
So you mentioned earlier, you alluded to earlier, Cynthia, that there's some like behind the scenes stories of putting this book together. And obviously the pandemic probably also threw off timelines and all sorts of things. Are there a couple stories that you want to share from that process?
Sure. So we started out, it was pre-pandemic, but I have to tell you, there were setbacks as a result of this that actually turned out to, so we had to make adjustments at different points along the way throughout the process. And in looking back, they turned out to be very serendipitous events that I think made the book better. But kind of going back, I talked about kind of collecting lots of projects. This starts out really early, beginning to see what might be possible. And then I bring this information to a small group within the museum and I say, what do you think of this idea? I get a green light, and then I'm able to do a little bit more of deep dive on it and continue my research. But then, and Pam, who's has been posting a little bit, who is the head of our cross-platform publishing, Pam Horn. I start to talk to her. So at the same time, I'm doing the building on the research. I'm talking about the book. I'm talking about physical exhibition within the space, where, which galleries are going in. And anybody who's on this call who is thinking about putting together a book, and this is my recommendation because it's my experience, you have to find an incredible partner like Pam to discuss and explore the ideas. She was somebody who, at the very beginning, and it's probably because she's done this, a score, she can tell you how many times she's done this, a multitude of times. What happened was she really forced me to, and helped me articulate my ideas and really hone some of the pieces, because I had to tell her what I was thinking. It was all in my head. I was gathering all this information, and there was this human being saying, what's in the book? How are you going to, what is the thesis? And so that was an amazing thing. So we started out with this idea. It was coming from cross-platform publishing, this idea for a book on demand. And it really fit in. I love to experiment. It was going to be a big experiment for us. The museum hadn't done it before. And what it did is we thought, okay, we'll create all the essays. We're going to make this a different kind of publication. It's going to be more than an exhibition, quote unquote, catalog. It's going to be a book that's going to stand on its own and talk to the variety of readers that we outlined, we spoke of before. And that meant it would be a lot more essays, different types of essays. And we would publish those at the beginning, well before the exhibition opened. And then we would follow, once we had collected all the 40 designs that were going to be on display, and then those could come later. And we had that flexibility to do that because it was going to be on demand. And then what happened within kind of the planning for this is COVID hit. And we were on track. And the reason we were going to do this is we were going to open in a year. It was on a really fast track. That's really short amount of time to publish a book and put an exhibition together. But COVID hit, which delayed everything. And it kept delaying, which allowed us I put together that advisory committee, that an international advisory committee. And coming out of that, I was able to see, and what they have the capacity to do is to help me see what I can't see. And so I was able to add some really key interviews and essays to the book. I cannot tell you that they just, and it was because of this delayed COVID schedule. And then we found out that we weren't able to make the on-demand book, which meant that we had to re-scramble and put together this real physical book that we've been talking about today. And then we found out the original book designer wasn't available, and we had to quickly, interview and select some pretty incredible book designers, and we landed on this wonderful studio. They're located in New Zealand. Practice, Sean James and James Boogan. And this is the other interesting thing, that you can read their design note. I don't know if you have that. The show, yeah, it's at the back of the book, and it's really interesting to read kind of we think it's very important, one, that because we're a design museum, that the readers understand the design intent for the book. And it's also a way for us to give the book designers a voice within the publication. And I think it really speaks to this way that not only what's included in the book, but I think the direction that design is taking these days, this very inclusive approach.
Yeah, I'll share a sentence from this. This is the design note. Obviously, I won't read the whole thing, but there's a couple sentences that I thought were really striking. We wanted to emphasize that the projects in this book are a form of collective action, what we think of as a simultaneous flow of work being done across the world. This flow starts on the cover. See the cover there? With Extinction Rebellion's prompt to act now, pulling readers in and connecting them with a variety of people, places, and movements. So you've got this call to action right from the beginning, and then the theory, and then the specific example. So I think it's a great way of pulling in the inside and the outside of the book together, connecting them all in this flow.
Yeah, and I think what you might be helpful is to show the cover and then open to the next spread, because that's really where it, not the back, the inside. So you open and then it's act now, and what might be possible if we were to design for the piece. And so there is this flow of images from page to page. And there was an intention, if you notice between the spreads, that there are, and we selected only images that included people. We really wanted to make sure that the humanity was included.
Right, the piece is not just beautifully designed objects and places that are devoid of actual people living their lives, right? Yeah, I think that's such an important message to really bring in there. So as we're starting to wind down, do you have any pointers or advice for designers who want to incorporate piece building into their practice? Do you have any tips or starting points beyond getting this book that they could maybe take away today?
Well, coming out of that advisory committee meeting, because we had both piece builders and designers, there is this, I think they identified this idea that piece building and design are both dynamic processes, right?
Right.
And they use very similar tools. They use engagement, trust building, communication, iteration, and an understanding of context to facilitate positive change. So my suggestion is, if you aren't using tools like that in your practice, you might begin to incorporate those into your practice.
Wonderful. Um, I feel like it's also important not to just be one of those like parachuting designers that parachute into different places, right? That because it has to deal with systems and communities and complexity. There are already people there working on this, whether it's community leaders or people doing humanitarian work that are already doing things that we might not immediately consider to be design, but there's ways to connect with those existing efforts.
Absolutely. That engagement with listening, I think, is always. I worked on a project in Thailand, and I was speaking with a community architect, and I asked him what is the most important skill that you can bring to your work, and he said listening.
Well, thank you all for listening and watching, tuning in today to this live stream, or if you're watching the recording, thank you for taking the time to watch the recording. I've been chatting with Cynthia E. Smith from the Cooper Hewitt Smithsonian Design Museum, also editor and author of this new book, Designing Peace, which you can get on artbook.com. Use AIGA member 25 to get 25% off the book. It's going to be shipping later on in July, but you can pre-order now. To take us out, Cynthia, are there any other sort of calls to actions that you have for where folks can find this exhibition and follow your work?
Sure. Please come to cooperhewitt.org. You can find this current work along with earlier work on not only the exhibition, but also the publications. And then we have put together a digital exhibition. So you can find that also at cooperhewitt.org. And we will be adding to that. That's the beauty of it. We'll continue to add content throughout this coming year. So
Wonderful.
please visit us there.
All right. I'm looking forward to visiting next time I'm back in New York and also following along online and then diving deeper into this book as well. So thanks, Cynthia. Thanks, everyone, for tuning in. See you at the next AIGA book event. Take care, everyone. Have a great week.